Hello and welcome to Talking Europe. The G20 was set up as a forum for world leaders to build consensus on economic and financial issues. But the group's latest summit in New Delhi has reflected the world's growing fractures, from rival blocs jostling for influence to competing views on the critical issues of our day: climate change, ending the war in Ukraine, or reforming global trade. To discuss how Europe fits into this increasingly complex picture, I'm joined by a very distinguished guest. Pascal Lamy was EU Trade Commissioner from 1999 to 2004 and Director General of the World Trade Organization from 2005 to 2013. He is now the coordinator for the Jacques Delors Institute in Paris, Berlin, and Brussels. Welcome to the program, Mr. Lamy.
Thank you very much for hosting me.
So let's talk about this G20 summit. The main aspect of it is that the leaders of China and Russia are not there. What's your reading of that?
I think it's a reflection of the state of the world. As you rightly said, the G20 was created to commonly address a number of global problems. It's a cooperative system, which today is obviously divided, not just between East and West, not just between North and South, but as we've seen, within what we unduly, in my view, too often call the Global South. The fact that Xi Jinping attended the BRICS summit, which worked according to his views in South Africa a few weeks ago, and that now, because Modi is trying to keep a foot on both sides, he doesn't join it, which is a severe diplomatic problem between US and China, I think is a revelation of how fractured we are, and we know what's at the origin of this. The likely origin of this diplomatic bundle is the fact that China published a new map of China, which apparently steps quite clearly on the territory of Chinese neighbors, not just with India, by the way, but elsewhere in the southeastern region. So it shows that we need other approaches to international cooperation.
And what approach should Europe take to international cooperation? Perhaps if we could focus on trade and what trade instruments it should use.
That's the first thing to do. Europe has to exercise influence where it is united. And it is united in economic and trade matters.
Perhaps not on China so much, but on other areas of the world.
I mean, we may not be as united to China as the US are, but we have our own attitude vis-à-vis China, which is a political rivalry, but an economic interdependence. And most Europeans do not believe we should go with China the way the US are going, which is trying to isolate China. And I agree personally with the notion that isolating China is not the way to go. If you make China more autarkic, China will be more dangerous than what it is. So there are differences, and I think the EU has, in a way, to play its own game in this very complex world.
So that game, is that basically completing the big trade deals that are unfinished? Is that the first priority, you think?
I think what the EU should work for is to address what matters as obstacle to trade today, which is mostly regulatory issues. What we need is a more level regulatory playing field. That's very complex, because regulations are about precaution. That's my difference between protectionism and precautionism. Protectionism is when you protect your producers from foreign competition. Precautionism is when you protect your people from risk, like, for instance, environment. Now, if EU installed a carbon border adjustment at its border, in my view, this is not protectionism. This is precautionism. We have to do that if we want to green the EU economy quicker than others. So these issues are the ones ahead of us, and I think we should be much less obsessed by tariffs, which, by the way, are usually low now, but more attuned to dealing with regulatory discrepancies.
Yeah, so emphasis on regulation and, in a sense, using the EU's soft power, because all of these trade negotiations come with chapters on environmental standards, labor standards, human rights standards.
Absolutely, and digital economy, governance and regulation, which are where, if we want to keep trade open, which we should do, not that it's always good for everybody. We have distributional issues which I think are there, but if we want to keep trade open, we have to try and keep leveling the playing field in a world which is more complex and on issues which have more to do with imagination than pure, 2 + 2 = 4. And this, I think, is the issue for the future.
You've argued before that, in fact, you said it on this channel, that Europe's future goes through Africa. And we've seen a new partnership agreement that's been agreed by the EU Council with the African, Caribbean and Pacific states. What do you make of that development?
No, I consider that, of course, China is important for Europe. Of course, the US is important for Europe. But long term, let's say 50 years from now, what will happen in Africa is the most decisive parameter of the EU economic and political future, not least because of reasons of proximity.
Yeah.
Whatever economic integration or political disintegration you have, geography still matters.
Yeah. Do you worry about the Russian flags that we've seen in these various countries that have gone through coups?
Of course I do. Of course I do, because it shows that the Russians are as good in manipulating public opinion in Africa as they've been in some developed countries.
Yeah. Do you have any answers to how the EU should respond to that?
I think the EU has to keep trying de-risking investments in Africa. Africa is a continent with a formidable economic potential. Lots of young Africans are really good at starting businesses. And I think the real issue, I recognize it may be too simple, but an average investor worldwide will ask for 10% return on equity. In Africa, he or she will ask for 15%. Why? Because the perception is that it's more risky. It's this 5% that we have to decrease in order for more investments, including, by the way, investments with African money. One of the paradoxes of today's Africa is that a lot of African money goes outside Africa instead of remaining invested in Africa. So de-risking Africa, I think, is the way to go.
And on climate finance and adaptation, that's one of the things that you address as a member of something called the Climate Overshoot Commission.
Yeah.
So tell us just a little bit about that.
Well, the Climate Overshoot Commission was created by the Paris Peace Forum, the purpose of which is to address international issues with new forms of cooperation, with NGOs, businesses, not just sovereigns. Given that sovereigns, as we know, are not that good at governing this planet for the moment. And we have, during 2 years, with a bunch of old monkeys of my kind, with a bit of experience, 7 from the south, 5 from the north, relooked at the risk of overshooting the 1.5 degree. And we are reopening all the options in carbon emission, carbon capture, adaptation, and even geoengineering, which is a pretty controversial topic, in order to be better at addressing global warming, and we know we are behind the curve. This raises a number of issues, and we will be making very bold proposals, which I will unveil in New York.
Pascal Lamy, you've been a prolific commentator on Brexit and on the British media, although perhaps a little less so in the last couple of years, but certainly after the referendum you were on British talk shows a lot. Just before we started this interview, you told me that you were talking to various interlocutors in the UK. What's your sense of where Britain is going on the whole Brexit issue, and what a possible future Labour government might do on this?
Well, let's look at facts. Brexit is more messy, more costly than we all expected, including people like me who were against Brexit. I thought it would be a problem. I didn't think it would be that big a problem. So this has to be fixed a way or another. And I recognize it's now very complex. But in a nutshell, my advice to my pals in the Labour Party in the Labour Party is very simple. The strategy should be keep the notion that you have divorced for political reasons, but keep sleeping together because that's the way to address the economic problem. So if you want to remain on the politics of Brexit, you say we've divorced, but if you want to reduce the cost for UK of this, keep sleeping together with Europeans.
But don't tell the British public that you're sleeping together. Is that the idea?
I think for some time that should be the game, while recognizing that there may be paparazzis here and there.
Got it. Thank you so much. Thank you. Good note to end on. That's all for part one. Well, I'll be back in a few minutes to ask my panel of pollsters and experts, do the peoples of Europe care about the 2024 European elections? Are they going to vote? And what issues actually motivate them? So do join me. That's coming up in a few minutes.